Thank you very much for joining us. I'm really pleased to be introducing this fantastic panel today. My name is Mark Walker and I'm the editorial director at the FinTech Times. We're going to be talking today about Combat Fraud Smarter, a fresh take on re-authentication. We've got an amazing set of panelists here. And just before I do get them to introduce themselves, I just want to give everybody a little bit of an overview of how you can interact with us today and what we're going to be doing. We're going to be running a number of polls throughout the show, 2 in total, and these are really going to help us steer the conversation in the areas that you really want to focus on and want to look at. And so the first poll we're going to put up onto the screen just as the panelists are going to go through and give themselves a little introduction. And this first one is important because it's really asking what types of fraud are on the rise at your organization. And the way you're going to be able to answer this one is we're going to put the questions up, the numbers up on the screen. You'll see a number in front of each of them. And within the group chat, just put in all the numbers that apply to you and your organization. And we'll be counting them up as we go through. So what I'm going to do first of all, I'm going to start off, and because of the order of my gallery here at the moment, I'm going to ask Blair to introduce himself first. And Blair, perhaps you give us a quick introduction, who you are, title, and a little overview of yourself.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to FinTech Times for hosting this, and thank you to Simon Marchand and Sarah Clark, my good friends, for joining me on this panel today. I'm Blair Cohen. I'm the founder and president at Authentic ID. For those of you that don't know, Authentic ID is a next-generation transformational AI-driven identity verification, identity authentication company, primarily serving large enterprises, banks, telcos, governments across the world today.
Fantastic. And then Sarah, you're next on my screen, so please give us a bit of an intro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Clark. I've been in the identity business for over a decade now. Right now, I am consulting through my own consultancy called Lens Identity. Prior to that, I spent 4.5 years at MasterCard, leading a groundbreaking digital identity business for ID Network as a way to share digital ID credentials globally. Before that, I spent over 5 years as the general manager of the identity business at Mitek, where I spearhead and led that business through international expansion. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to have you here. And last but not least, Simon, if you could give us a quick intro.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Blair, for the invitation. And thank you, FinTech Times for giving us the opportunity to talk about this super important topic. So my name is Simon. I've been spending the past 15 years in the anti-fraud business. Most of that career was spent as a fraud practitioner. I ran fraud teams in the banking world and the telco world before moving on the technology side, where I've developed technologies on the voice biometric sectors. I spent almost 5 years there before moving to geolocation, device fingerprinting, and compliance. So I'm now an independent consultant helping fintechs, banks review their fraud strategies, their identity proofing strategies. I also work with different technology providers to help them with their messaging, their positioning, and their strategic roadmap.
Fantastic. So I guess before we get really into, and I see great that there's plenty of people that are giving me some answers to our first poll. Before we get into too much, I wonder, Blair, if I could come to you, and I just want to, obviously the title of this webinar is re-authentication. So let's maybe just, if you could just frame it a little bit for us, what are we talking about when we talk about re-authentication, and what is the original authentication, if you like?
The original authentication generally, in the past, historically anyway, involved you physically going into a branch and having your identity verified. And then a re-authentication by a person, inhuman. As COVID happened, of course, that just wasn't possible. You weren't able to walk into a brick and mortar to a physical location and have Sarah look at your ID and ask you a bunch of questions and determine whether you are a real person or not. So over the past few years, this identity verification piece has been done remotely. Lots of different ways for that to occur. But the topic of this conversation is more re-authentication. So once I know who Sarah is, there are going to be times during my relationship with Sarah where I need to really verify that it's still Sarah transacting with me. That may be a password reset. That may be an address change. That may be adding a new user to the account. It may be something abnormal for Sarah's previous history. She's never before sent a $50,000 wire transfer to Guatemala. All of a sudden she's doing that. I really want to verify that this is Sarah performing this transaction. So that's the act of re-authentication, if you will. And it's evolved a ton over the years, Mark. I've been doing this for a long time. And historically, that was done by one of two ways, one of which is called KBA, or out of wallet questions. So we would ring Sarah or send Sarah a text and say, hey, looks like you're trying to perform this transaction. Can you answer these questions? And historically, that would work, because the questions that were posed to Sarah would be questions that theoretically she was the only one that could answer. Today, that's no longer the case. All of our data has been breached many, many, many times. I think that NIST has been recommending that no company utilize KBA or out-of-wallet questions since about 2016. Nevertheless, I had dinner the other night with one of the major identity providers, and literally 40% of their portfolio, and I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year in annual spend, are being spent on KBA. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. First of all, the fraudsters are more adept and proficient at answering those questions than real humans are. The questions have gotten super obscure. It takes a long time, and then it creates a lot of friction. So when you ask me a question and I can't answer what the address of my house that I lived in 20 years ago, it's kind of a silly question, and I'm going to get frustrated if you ask me questions that I can't answer and you tell me I'm not who I say I am. So the less friction, and there's this pressure to move to lower friction to be able to re-authenticate somebody. The less friction method that's pretty popular these days, it's their second most popular product, is one-time passwords. So we've all gotten an SMS on your phone that says, please verify your identity. Well, that is great. It's super low friction. It's pretty easy for you to open up your device and just click, yes, this is me. Unfortunately, it's not deterministic, right? It just tells you that somebody, whether it was the real user or somebody that was performing a man-in-the-middle attack, received that text message and acknowledged it. But we don't know who. So and then the third thing that we see a lot of today, again, more on that low friction thing, is device authentication. So silently, we know a lot about your device. We know who owns this device. We know the footprint of that device. We know whether it's been jailbroken or not. So silently, you can re-authenticate that device is the one actually performing this transaction that's out of band for Sarah. But again, you've got that same vulnerability, right? What if I had possession of Sarah's device? The transaction is going to be approved. So what we're seeing that has become much more popular, that is kind of the perfect combination, if you will, of fraud prevention and low friction and user experience, is biometrics. It's just so simple, and it's deterministic at the end of the day. If you get that text, and instead of just saying, yes, I own this device, but you're prompted to provide your voice or provide your face, and I already know what your voice and face look like. It's very simple, and it's just like opening your iPhone today. It's as simple as looking at your device, and then deterministically, the company at the end of this transaction knows for sure that Simon is requesting this $50,000 wire transfer, that Sarah is requesting this person be added to their account. And they have this audit trail now. So that's where we're seeing the market move today for us.
Okay, interesting. I mean, just winding back a little bit back into the historical side of things. Obviously, looking at sort of Sarah, as you said, been at MasterCard for quite a long time. Simon, a lot of history in that sort of banking sector as well. I guess banks were originally not set up to deal with device-specific stuff because people weren't really using devices. It wasn't really mobile banking at that time. What was the sort of infrastructure requirements for the original sort of authentication methods? Was it all paper, pen, people coming up into branches, that type of approach? Maybe Simon, from your perspective, how quickly have we moved from that original old period into this new method of having to do much cleaner, frictionless re-authentication?
We've moved very quickly. Um, we had to. We had to, right? In 3 weeks, the whole world came to a halt, and we had to find other ways to work remotely with customers. So a lot of banks, a lot of government services had to move from that, in-person security assurance kind of process where you could have the physical driver's license in your hand and even pass it under, a 3M scanner, make sure it's a real thing, to having to do everything remotely. The problem here is it was often only a way to move away from that KYC process that used to be in person to a KYC process that was, remote. The big problem there is once you've done that KYC, once you've onboarded that person, you don't really know who's taking control of the rest of the interaction. If you have on-device biometrics used, let's say to unlock your account, well, the bank doesn't really know which biometric has been put on that device. My face being used when I on board against my passport, then it's me. I'm matching my ID, but you don't know which face has been stored on that phone. So I could hand it over to someone else, and they could keep using my account. So I think that's where things are taking a bit more time. Now we see growing concerns in making sure we have strong re-authentication, leveraging biometrics, especially as we see big regulatory changes such as the push payment scams liability in the UK. Now banks are being held liable. They need to prove that the person took actively part in the transaction, that they decided to ignore very obvious warning signs that they were being part of a scam. So now you need to take those extra steps to say, yeah, it's not necessarily my victim's phone, it's not necessarily my victim's password, or they're not necessarily providing my OTP, but I've matched their face against the face that I know for that person. That is the face I verified against government issued IDs. And I think that's the part that took a while. But now that we see accelerating again, because regulations are changing in some countries and they're pushing all of the big financial institutions to review their standards, review their perspective on how they should do that re-authentication process. And in the end, really recognizing that, yes, your device fingerprinting is great for lots of things, but there are some very high-risk transactions, adding a new payee, sending a big wire transfer for the first time, changing your address, even activating services, making sure I can activate international wires, for example. All of these very high-risk transactions might require that additional check to prevent manipulation, social engineering on one end, but also collusion, money laundering, making sure you're compliant on the other hand, making sure you're not handing over your account to someone in a no-fac restricted jurisdiction, for example, or to someone that you would be willingly sharing your identity with. So yeah, hopefully we'll see that accelerate in the coming months.
Absolutely. And I guess, Sarah, from your perspective, I'm trying not to use the C word from COVID, but obviously COVID had a major change. But obviously from your experience in shopping behaviours, that was obviously massively changed, not just because of that period, but was changing anyway, to be less in person and more online. Is that also an area that you think is driving the requirements for re-authentication?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just for clarity, I worked in a different kind of division at MasterCard where we were building an identity network. So we worked across multiple verticals. So like you said, everything from shopping and merchants to supporting financial services to a whole plethora of others. And I guess I'd just like to echo something that Simon pointed out. I think there's been a lot of work done within financial services as well as numerous other verticals when it comes to onboarding and applying new technology for digital onboarding. But what's been left is the gulf between onboarding and ongoing authentication. So that is a really key point, I think, for the audience, is that needs to be resolved. And the best possible solution is to utilize an onboarding flow that collects a selfie, because at the end of the day, it is important no matter kind of what vertical you're in. If you're seeing risk in your business from fraud, you need to know definitively that that is a real person on the other end of that transaction. And something like shopping may have a lower risk profile than financial services that might have enhanced KYC requirements. But ultimately, you need to know that you're onboarding a real individual. And then being able to bring that forward into ongoing authentication by using that selfie as your blueprint for who you will recognize going forward for authentication use cases is really critical. And the good news is there's a lot of ways to do that today, a variety of vendors in the landscape that offer that. And what's another use case that I would like to point out in the context of financial services that's really key and something that I would assert is high risk is account recovery. I think, Simon, you may have touched on that. New device, lost device, lost my password, what have you. All of that can essentially go away and become self-service with the right type of biometric authentication solution. And, I've seen results where that has reduced operational costs for a financial services company by 90%. And it also really increases security because fraudsters are going to flow to the path of least resistance. And in addition to the gulf between identity verification and ongoing authentication, I see account recovery as being one of the paths that's kind of pushed to the bottom of the list, but that can have the highest impact. And really, the best solution in market that folks should be looking for is something that offers the benefits of two-factor authentication using biometrics. And by that, what I mean is when you're done with identity verification, you can attach the biometric to the device, but that also offers a device portability solution. So what's really exciting about this field is all the innovation. Using some of the cryptographic innovations, it is absolutely possible to have the best of both worlds. Two-factor biometric-driven authentication, leveraging both the biometric and the device without having to rely on a honeypot on the back end. And when you have something like that plugged into your offering, whether you're a financial services organization or giving loyalty rewards or the plethora of verticals in between, you can truly offer a great user experience and fill those gaps when it comes to account takeover and things that can impact your customers as well as your business operationally.
Interesting. I saw, Blair, you doing lots of thumbs up, so I was going to ask you to comment anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the account recovery use case. And, that's a very expensive thing for an enterprise to perform. I've seen companies that spend as much as $70 for an account recovery call. So to eliminate that and make that self-service where somebody could simply click on a button, not only does it save the company a whole lot of money, but it's a great user experience too. You can recover your account in seconds versus minutes or sometimes hours.
Yeah, and I guess that's
to that, if I can jump in, but with account recovery and even pair it with some of the vulnerabilities you still see today in a lot of organizations. I'll take my bank as an example. I won't tell you which bank it is. That way nobody is going to exploit that vulnerability.
He's Canadian.
But I'm Canadian, so it narrows it down quite a bit. But when you log in, the two-factor authentication they suggest is a push notification, which is better than an SMS. That said, you have the ability to choose and say, I do not have access to my phone. Please send me an SMS instead. So you're basically giving fraudsters an out. You're telling them, okay, well, if you don't have access to the device, you haven't been able to infect it, just do a quick SIM swap and you'll be able to intercept that SMS. Giving that opportunity because you want to reduce friction for legitimate customers really opens the door for fraudsters. But if that biometric print was stored server-side, I could use any kind of device and still be able to use my face as the strongest possible authentication factor. So, recovering an account, making sure I get that 2FA on whichever device I'm going to get access to, that is key. We know that fraudsters for a very long time, they were going to, telcos straight in a store saying, well, I'm Blair. I've lost my phone at the bottom of a lake. So you cannot send me an SMS. You cannot validate who I am. You cannot call me. I need a new phone and I need you to attach my phone number to it. So, instead of doing an account takeover over the phone to start intercepting my traffic, They would just go straight into store, use that little back door, that workaround. But if a biometric print had been attached to my profile, they could literally say, well, okay, just look into that iPad, we'll match it with the face we have on file and make sure that they don't transfer an account to someone that doesn't deserve to receive it. So it's not only lowering the friction for customers, making sure they can recover, self-serve and all of that, it also increases the bar quite a bit for fraudsters, and it closes a few of the gaps that they're typically exploiting.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And that isn't future stuff that Simon's talking about. This is actually deployed, and it's solving the problem. I didn't know you worked in the telco industry that much, but the bottom of the lake problem is a known problem in the telco industry. And at one of the major telcos today, you can literally walk in and say, my wallet, phone are at the bottom of the lake, but I'm Blair. They'll take a picture of you, know that it's really me, and hand me a phone over the counter without any other verification required. So again, great user experience, great confidence that it's really Blair transacting.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of, talking about the power of biometrics, it's that ability to reduce friction while still having a strong authentication source. And I guess maybe thinking a little bit about sort of, there's a few myths around there at the moment around biometrics and lack of security. And, I remember way back when the iPhone first had a thumbprint on it. Everyone was like, yeah, but you can use any thumb and any thumb will open it and that sort of stuff. So maybe sort of Sarah, maybe starting with you, what's some of the fun myths that you've seen and ones that can be explained away?
Yeah, the myths that I've seen, well, let me just say that was the gummy bear thumb thing that was going around, and everybody was trying to imprint their thumb in a gummy bear and then stick the gummy bear on the phone. So I guess some of the myths, let's see. First of all, liveness has come a long way. And I would say that it's gone into myth territory for me, that the individual needs to do a bunch of stuff in order to really perform a deep liveness check. And what I mean by that is AI has, helped this industry evolve. So it is certainly possible to offer single frame liveness to a very deep level. And if you're in financial services, again, the question you need to answer is this a real person? And is this the person I expect it to be? Definitely on the other end of this transaction. And biometrics are the answer to that, but biometrics with really strong liveness and presence detection is the answer to that. And if you believe that requires the individual to jump through a bunch of hoops, I would call that a myth at this point. There have been a lot of innovations with single frame liveness. Another I would say is that there's a trade-off between sort of security as well as user experience. And what I mean by that is the algorithms have come so far. You can get to effectively a false acceptance rate of close to zero, meaning you're not letting any of the wrong people in, while having a false rejection rate of something that is extraordinarily small as well. So this is really an industry that, on the dimensions of liveness, as well as just the ability to cross-check a biometric, have evolved so much that it almost makes no sense that somebody would not be utilizing these types of products in authentication, re-authentication experiences. Let me stop there and allow other people to chime in.
I was going to say, and we've actually got a question that's come through from Michael that's really saying about how can you avoid users getting sick of re-authentication, even with biometrics. Now, that in itself sounds to me that might actually be a myth as well, because how intrusive is the real authentication methods that we use with biometrics? I don't know, Blair, if you want to take on that one.
I mean, yeah, I'm scratching my head on that one just a little bit, Mark. I open my iPhone, I don't know, probably 100 times a day. I don't get sick from doing that. And the experience that we're describing here is very, very similar to opening up your iPhone. Perhaps it takes, a couple milliseconds, a few hundred milliseconds longer than that process that we've just described, but still it's super fast. And, there's just zero friction. Your company needs this. Hey, people are actually doing this to log into their computer these days. So we're taking it beyond just re-authentication and just passwordless login. I want to know who's logging into my computer on my network every single day. So I don't know. We haven't really seen that people get sick and tired of it. I think they actually appreciate it. When they know that we're protecting their $50,000, they appreciate it. Simon, please take
it's
away.
It's a myth, right? I think it's right to point it out. We do it every day. We do it multiple times in an hour. Thinking that people will get sick of it is quite the myth to debunk, right? They're used to it. And not only that, but they kind of expect it now. Like we're now seeing that paradigm shift where if I go in my bank and I try to log into my account and they're not asking for my biometric factors and they're letting me go through all the steps to make a transaction without protecting me adequately, I will be kind of concerned that they're not doing enough to protect me. I'm going to start to ask myself, is this a bank I can trust? So biometrics does not just become a way to protect, it also becomes a competitive advantage if you know how to position it. If you position it as, a trust building factor in your relationship with customers, I've seen banks make public campaigns, advertisement on TV to say that they were using biometrics in the past, to say like, this is how serious we are about your security. Yeah. We take, protecting your assets as a responsibility, maybe more seriously than others. And they were really positioning it like that. So I don't think people are going to see that as a pain point. Maybe one of the myths I want to touch on is, deep fakes and Gen AI. I'm starting to hear more and more, and it's kind of sad. Let's avoid biometrics because now we can generate deep fakes and we can generate deep voices, and it makes biometrics irrelevant. Quite the contrary to start with. It makes biometrics more relevant than ever. And I think we need to really look at deepfakes and their impact on human beings. And they're very convincing when they're used against humans. That's why we see most of the deepfakes being used in investment scams. We're going to have someone, pose as Elon Musk, inviting you to invest your money in something because there's no controls around it. And it's good enough to fool the human ear or the human eyes. But when it comes to, enterprise grade biometrics, the liveness detection that Sarah was talking about, as well as the deepfake detection, everything that's embedded in the process of verifying if it's you, helps make sure that a deepfake of you would not pass, even though it might be good enough to fool your family. So yeah, Gen AI and deepfake technology, that's been around for a few years, just made easier to use nowadays, is very striking. It does make a great show, when you're in the news. But the truth is, it really emphasizes the importance for banks to have a strong enterprise-grade partner that can prove that they're doing continuous research and development, because their legitimate customers will eventually be impersonated through that technology, and you need to have it, well put in place and implemented to make sure you stop it. So yeah, good enough to fool the humans, usually not good enough to fool a system.
I guess that's probably why it has become a myth, because everybody looks at it and goes, well, if I just do that, that's easy. And they can get any deep fake. I've seen loads of deep fakes of Elon Musk, dancing and doing other things. So surely a deep fake can do that. But as you say, we're looking at it with human eyes, not with, enterprise grade biometrics in that sort of thing. So I guess from that point of view, maybe from your point of view, Blair, I guess there's a bit of an educational side of things. And do you think even financial institutions still believe that myth, or do you think that is more of a consumer myth at the moment when it comes to?
They're coming. They're moving slowly. I mean, this is a relatively new fraud vector, this Gen AI stuff. In the past, a human could detect it. 3 or 4 years ago, a human that was actually paying attention, I think you could tell the difference between a fake Elon and a real Elon. Today, I don't think it's possible. I've seen very, very, very impressive Gen AI tools that would certainly fool me. Banks are addressing this, but I still see a lot of manual review. I still see where their default, when something looks a little bit funny, means send it to the call center, let a human put eyes on it. And that scares the heck out of me, because I'm an expert at this, Simon's an expert at this, Sarah's an expert at this. And I think we'd all admit that we could easily be fooled by this with our eyes. It takes technology to uncover that sort of threat. Just one more myth that I think we missed before, and I hate to go back in this, Mark, but we missed the biggest myth about biometrics, and that's their accuracy. There's been a lot of reports, a lot of bad reporting over the past years where, people were saying that it improperly identified members of Senate 75% of the time. And a lot of these things are taken out of context. I will tell you that today biometrics, particularly face biometrics, are extremely accurate. It doesn't matter whether you're 80 or 18. It doesn't matter whether you're a male or a female. It doesn't matter if your skin type is any one of those 6 different skin tones. It doesn't matter. The demographic differential amongst all of those different populations that I just described, amongst the top performing algorithms, is so minute, it's almost non-existent. So don't be afraid that biometrics don't work and that they're going to let somebody else wrongly into your account, or that you're going to be misidentified. That just doesn't happen today.
Yeah. I may be thinking from your point of view, Sarah, how does an organization, sort of a big organization, a big financial organization, which is inherently trying to avoid risk at all costs, how can they be convinced of the sort of the accuracy of biometrics? Is that something where there's a sort of a culture change within the organization that needs to happen first before they can start thinking about those sort of accuracies?
Well, I guess first of all, when they begin engaging with vendors in the space, a vendor who is good will be transparent with their metrics. So, as I was referring to earlier, there's something called a false acceptance rate, which is the wrong people being let in. That should be effectively zero, or it can be effectively zero if tuned well. And then you have something called a false rejection rate, which is how many good people may not make it in because of the tuning. A vendor who is reputable and should be trusted in the space will have their metrics. Additionally, there are neutral third parties that do this testing. Look for vendors who have NIST tests that are published, and they publish these results as well as sort of other dimensions. So hopefully those types of testing at scale can provide confidence. And lastly, I mean, A/B testing, split testing has been around for a long time. For the more conservative organizations, you can utilize that and see the difference in results. That becomes more complicated under the hood, of course, because you need a test cohort and a experiment cohort. But I would say look for vendors who are transparent with their results and who have subscribed to independent testing. The independent testing is robust. NIST publishes test results. And I've been kind of deep in those weeds, and those tests are extensive. So I feel at this point in maturity, there should really be no hesitation around the ability, especially to do a one-to-one match for a biometric. Some of the other dimensions that I would encourage folks to look at, however, are, there's device-side biometrics, then server-side biometrics. Server-side can provide benefits in terms of device portability, especially. But it's really, really important as well today to look at those vendors in the market that are doing that in a responsible manner. Cryptography has come a long way. Zero knowledge proof based solutions have come a long way. It's also important to be compliant with regulations and protecting the data privacy of your own customers. So in addition to looking at testing results, also look at how a portable server-side offering is handling biometric templates. If they're responsible, they're doing it in a way where essentially those are not templates that are being stored. I could get really deep on that. I won't. But I would encourage that to be another way to look at the problem, because oftentimes in financial services, they are concerned about that. They should be. They need to meet regulatory requirements. They need to protect the privacy of their customers. And there are solutions out there that are great with results for user experience that also are not storing biometric templates as a honeypot. So look for those two things.
Okay, and I guess just from,
To,
I was
to
going to
add,
say,
if you'll allow me to
yeah,
add on what
please.
Sarah was
Yeah.
saying, false accept, false reject are definitely the kind of data points you need to ask about. Keep in mind that some vendors might decide to give you only one or only the other, and it's a slider, right? If you want to tune your false accept, it's going to let your false reject go up, vice versa. So asking about the equal error rate might be a good way to make sure that they don't tweak their response and they're actually giving you the intersection where these two ratios are exactly the same. And tracking equal error rate across multiple vendors or even across multiple versions of the same vendors' algorithms is a good way to compare them objectively if they're providing you with the data. But it's also a good way to see how good they are at improving their own accuracy, version over version over version. So equal error rate is just a combination of these two previous data points. The three of them together makes for great objective data to look at as you're looking for new vendors.
Yeah. And I guess from your perspective, sort of, Blair, on the same sort of thing, there's different, as we were saying, different methods for the storing of the biometrics. That's effectively what we're talking about, isn't it? Could you maybe give us a little bit of a sort of an understanding of the different versions and what that's all about?
Oh gosh, you wanted to cause trouble here, Mark,
Yeah.
huh? This is a very contentious debate. So basically, we have, and Sarah already said it, we have device-side biometrics or you have server-side biometrics. If you think about the bottom of the lake problem that we talked extensively about earlier, you can't solve that problem with device-side biometrics. It has to be central storage. I mean, you've already lost your device. It's at the bottom of the lake. You can't walk into the TOCA with your device or authenticate yourself. The device is gone. So the benefits that you have from server side, that's just one example. I'll leave some room for Sarah and Simon to chime in and talk about some of the other benefits of server side versus device side. But one more thing I'll say about device side is, and if you think about how you get in, how you authenticate there, it's going to be a biometric initially, but if your biometric fails, what does it default to? It defaults to a PIN code, typically a 4-digit PIN code. So that's the low level of vulnerability there, and that's too much for most people to accept. What else would you folks say on server versus device side?
On the benefits of server side, so yes, portability and everything. Let's switch to fraud. Being able to cluster biometric models together to try to find the face of fraudsters coming multiple times is absolutely key. And I'll tell you one story for that. There was a bank operating out of Ireland a couple of years ago, and they were opening accounts that were turning fraud, and they didn't quite understand why, because they were doing proper KYC. They were matching face against a European Union, recognized piece of ID. What they eventually realized was that all of these IDs were absolutely legitimate, but they were created by a government official out of Romania that was using government machines to generate driver's licenses with the same photo, but with different identities. So if you only look at, the identity in a funnel, you only look at, okay, that's Blair's face against Blair's ID, close it, move on, and you don't do processing on the server side, what you'll be missing is when the same fraudster comes 20 times, 30 times, 40 times with legitimate IDs that might have been obtained through collusion, that might be good fakes. So being able to do it server side gives you a huge lift on the fraud prevention efforts, because it allows you to say, well, I've seen this face 5 times today. It tried to break through 5 different accounts, or it tried to open 5 different accounts, and it really allows you to take your anti-fraud operation kind of one step further. If you do it device side, obviously that's not something you're going to be able to do, because the biometric print never leaves that device to get into your server. You're never able to do that check unless you do something manual, which we know already it's not something that's scalable. So that's one of the huge benefits of doing it server side, that fraud prevention capability.
So obviously I've got to do the other side, and I've got to say, well, I don't want you to own my identity. I want to own my own identity. So what do we say, Sarah, to people that are saying, this is affecting my human rights by you storing my identity? I want to own it myself. Where do we go with that conversation?
So I very much agree with that sentiment. I have spent the last 5 years of my career working on decentralized solutions, all about empowering individuals to own their own identity. That said, that also does collide a bit with what Simon was advocating for, which is essentially a one-to-end match on a biometric, specifically at the time of onboarding somebody to an account. And I very much agree that that is a huge fraud vector. We saw that through our work at MasterCard. It's a meaningful check that should be taken seriously. Now, the good news, however, is it's not black or white, and people shouldn't look at it as such. It's not device side versus server side. A field that I've been very involved in, and this was our work at MasterCard, has to do with decentralized tenants. Cryptography is the layer that lies below the tenets of decentralization, and I know I'm getting a bit technical, but essentially what that means is that there are ways to securely create the ability to store, whether it be limited or, fully masked biometrics that allow for checks on the server side while not creating a honeypot and while ultimately respecting an individual's right to own their biometric and their digital identity. It's a lot to get into in the bounds of this webinar, but certainly for folks that are interested in this, feel free to hit me up. But what's exciting is that there are innovations that will allow for both. As an individual, you should be able to own your own data. As financial services and other verticals, we should not be contributing to honeypots that are storing biometrics in a giant database or biometric templates. That can be hacked, those can be used, and that can impact your customers. We don't want that. We want solutions that are applying the latest technology, whether it's cryptography or decentralization, in order to achieve the goals that we need to achieve in order to empower individuals and also get rid of fraud. And that's possible today. So I'll just leave it at that without getting too much deeper.
I was aware I was opening a hole. Yeah.
You want to make sure, that your customer has given proper consent to have that happen. And you want to make sure that this biometric print that's been encrypted, within the organization cannot be used somewhere else. So as a consumer, I should have to provide consent to every bank, every telco, every merchant. Every time they decide to store that biometric print, I should have that liberty. And I think it gives you a bit more control, a bit more power on what you're going to do. Now, the organization, on the other hand, can decide to say, well, we want you to authenticate using biometrics. Here's the incentive, right? Because we know that using biometric prints will secure to the highest level given transactions. We'll give you a lot more permissions on what you can achieve if you enable this capability. Otherwise, you can decide not to give it to us, but we'll limit. So one good example is a bank in Australia where you can make a wire transfer without limit. You can transfer $100,000, but the condition is you have to provide a biometric check checked against the server side. And fraud has gone to zero on that particular channel, and consumers are accepting it because of the convenience of not having any kind of limits. Now, if you do not want to have your biometric print stored by the bank, there's no problem, but you have to go in a branch and be physically present to be able to do that wire. So being able to show that you're going to remove, a lot of the friction, a lot of the hurdles for specific types of transactions might be key to driving people to accept to share that biometric information. But again, I think Sarah has a very good point. As an organization, you have the responsibility to demonstrate that you're encrypting all of that in a proper manner, that you're not storing, raw images or raw audio, but you're really just keeping the mathematical model that represents your biometric print. And we've seen some vendors not be so thorough in how they were storing that. So choosing the right vendor, making sure that you understand how that's going to be handled, that's going to be key to make sure you maintain trust with your consumers.
Fantastic. What we're going to move into sort of the idea of implementation strategies and that now, and I'm going to come to you, Blair, shortly after that to maybe kick us off. But I also wanted to just put out our final poll as well, which is really trying to ask the people that are watching what sort of tactics they are currently using to fight fraud. And so we're going to put the options up again on the main screen, and you'll have a couple of options. You can select all of them, none of them, as you did before. So, and hopefully, as we get through this next stage, we can come to that solution at the end of it. So yeah, maybe Blair, if we could come to you and sort of think, we've talked an awful lot about debunking the myths of biometrics and the benefits. So where do people have to start when they start thinking about wanting to implement them?
Oh, super great question. We've kind of talked a lot about the power of biometrics and how great they can be for both sides of the equation, both the consumer and the enterprise transacting. Where the vulnerability there is self assertion. So I know of a place in the airport, for example, where you can walk up and see, I want to get in this frequent traveler line. Here's my ID. A human's looking at it, and you immediately enroll your face and your fingerprints. Gosh, does that make sense? Now I'm forever who I just asserted, or whatever it said on that identity document, which may or may not have been real. I'm forever that person, and I can go up to this kiosk and show my face and show my fingers, and now I'm that person. So you have to start with strong identity proofing, is my point to this, Mark. We have to make sure that I know without a doubt that this is Sarah's face, that this is Sarah's voice that I'm enrolling. Otherwise, the integrity of everything that we've just discussed goes out the window. So you have to start there. And in the past, I've seen people doing that kind of the low friction way. I'll send an email to you on your MasterCard account. And if Sarah can open up that email on the MasterCard account, then it must be Sarah. And they would allow that person to enroll their biometrics and reuse them in a variety of different ways. That's flawed. That needs to be really relooked at. So I'll stop there. Simon, Sarah?
Yeah, Simon, do you want to?
I think we've highlighted some of those vulnerabilities already, right? And I think, Blair really puts it well. Like, if you don't have the right controls in the first place, you're done. You're just letting everybody in. And don't assume that because an ID comes and it appears legitimate, or it is a legitimate ID, you don't have anything else to check. Those IDs, like I said earlier, can be produced on real machines through government offices, and they will make it very easy for fraudsters to generate multiple passports, multiple driver's licenses, or otherwise, and then run with it. And if you only focus on that, you're going to be missing on a lot of fraud. It's going to blow in your face, 6 months down the road. So you really need to make sure you protect all steps of the customer journey, and which brings us to reauthentication as well. Having proper controls in place at onboarding is one thing. Maybe being able to cluster faces is one thing, but you need to make sure every once in a while you're going to keep checking that face as it comes back to make sure that it hasn't been handed over to someone else, to make sure that you don't have a blind spot in some of your processes that leads someone to adding a payee, making a big wire transfer, changing an address or communication method. So yeah, that vulnerability is always, I think, the first gate. But then your other vulnerability is not putting proper controls for proper transactions. So that's why it becomes a big risk assessment exercise to determine, okay, here's the list of transactions that do warrant a reauthentication. And then we implement it like we said earlier.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing from a lot of the responses that have come in is that ID verification software is things that people are using at the moment. And that kind of feels to me that that's kind of where everybody is with the initial KYC and getting people authenticated and on. But I guess ongoing verification, is that more complicated to implement, do you think, Sarah? And is that why people are perhaps not quite there yet with the ongoing re-authentication?
Well, I don't know if I can say it's more complicated to implement. I think that there's been complacency with passwords and sort of the status quo, right? That's existed, and digital onboarding was more urgent, especially for financial services. To the earlier point, it used to be you would walk in and open a bank account, and that was normal. And then you have a password, and that's normal. So priorities, I think, drove digital onboarding to be number one. But mule accounts and, account takeover fraud, in my view, should be driving priority number two at this point. So again, don't do authentication in a silo from identity verification. Ensure they're connected. Even if you use a different vendor, same vendor, it shouldn't matter. The two can be connected. So I think it's just a matter of urgency given where things were at, where the status quo was at, et cetera. But that's changing. I've worked with a number of companies in financial services and beyond that have moved forward with passwordless authentication and have gotten great measured results, 70% less account takeover fraud, 90% efficiencies in call centers, that type of thing. So I see that tide is changing.
Okay, interesting. Maybe Blair, coming to you. Obviously, we've had the poll running with numerous different things, and one of the options at the bottom was none of the above, which obviously feels like everybody should be doing something. Is it a question of we should have another option on there, which is all of the above? Is that the sort of the ideal that you're going towards, where you use every single one of those tactics?
All of these signals add up to additional confidence. And for many, many companies, yes, all of the above would be a wise choice, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I guess the reasoning why that's probably not the case at the moment, from your point of view, why are organizations not doing everything?
Probably cost. Some of these things are difficult and expensive to implement. But I think a lot of companies are. I mean, we deal with very sophisticated enterprises and telcos and government. And in many cases, those companies that I just mentioned are utilizing all six of those different modalities for authentication and for proofing identity verification.
Simon, coming to you, you mentioned a little while back when we were talking about APP fraud, etc., that liability is now moving to the banks, the financial institutions in some jurisdictions. Is that going to drive bigger adoption of using biometrics and re-authentication?
It already is. It already is. We're seeing it in the UK. There's a big move. In the UK, mind you, biometric was already well adopted. What we tend to see is it's now used in a lot more steps of the customer journey. Like I said earlier, right? It's not just at the onboarding phase or when someone calls in, but like now, I will be held responsible as a bank to pay the first £85,000 on an APP scam within 5 days. There's no time to investigate. I just have to pay it back to my customer. The only thing that can make you walk away from this as a bank is to prove that you've given proper warnings to the right person and that you purposely ignored all of your warnings. So there is a necessity to be able to say, yes, it was that person. They took part in the transaction, not because it was their device, because I saw their face. And then I presented the warning here and they decided to override my warnings. So there's that need to put that biometric more and more. Now, in Canada, where it's not necessarily as strong, we see it more and more. There's a lot of concerns with what's happening in the UK, how quickly it's going to come here, especially as we walk, slowly but surely into open banking. It's going to open the market to a lot more small fintechs and startups. So that concern around security and making sure we have the highest level, the highest standards is growing. And I would say, in the US, which is probably a bit more advanced, what we tend to see is a lot more of the smaller organizations now focus on biometrics because the big ones now have it. They've implemented it. But the small, medium banks and financial institutions, amongst the 6,000 financial institutions in the US, they're now starting to see fraudsters come to their level because they're now the easier targets and they still have quite a bit of assets to exploit. So yeah, I think that liability shift is going to change the way we perceive it, but also the fact that the big ones are already investing is pushing fraudsters down. It's putting a lot more pressure on the smaller players to find a vendor that's going to be cheap, easy to work with, that doesn't require tremendous resources to start implementing. Biometrics 10 years ago was a lot more effort to deploy than it is today. And for a small player, a small credit union that has 5-6 branches, they can't afford to put 10 developers on this for 6 months. So that also becomes an increasing concern. I want to make sure I find someone that's strong, that makes the R&D for me, that will maintain deepfake detection, liveness detection, but also that won't require me a huge investment to start deploying in my own platform. And we see this a lot more these years.
Yeah, I was trying not to offend everybody else as panelists, being the only Brit on the call and saying, why is the Brit ahead of everyone else? But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Just thinking a little bit from, sort of wrapping things up a little bit now. Obviously, the implementation takes time. There's lots of going. If I was to come to sort of each of you as a sort of a final thought, maybe starting with Sarah, where do we think we will be this time next year, for example? And how much further forward will we be? Will we be looking at different challenges and different problems, or do you think we will have overcome some of these issues?
Oh gosh, this time next year. So a year is not a long time. I'm not even sure how to answer that. I think that, obviously the AI challenge, et cetera, is heating up, but I think you're just going to see a lot more of this. Like we've seen FIDO take off. Again, I don't think FIDO is the perfect solution for financial services. It requires use cases that bring phishing resistant two-factor authentication together with server-side capabilities. But I personally can see like some rising innovations that I think are just going to take off because they're just hitting the mark, and there's a lot of demand for this type of thing. People are used to using biometrics on their devices. I think somebody mentioned that earlier. So I believe it is a myth that there is a user experience deterrent. I think if anything, it's an incentive. People love it. Choose vendors that offer experience in milliseconds with single frame liveness, and that offer a combination of two-factor authentication on the device side with secure non-honeypot capabilities on the server side. All of that is like coming to fruition now. So I think we're just going to see more momentum in a year.
Fantastic. Everyone now knows I'm coming to them with the same questions, so hopefully they've all been preparing their answers. Simon, from your perspective, took a look into your crystal ball. What we're going to be looking at next year?
Yeah, I hate my crystal ball because when it's unreliable, people tell you about it, right? But what I think is that next year we'll be having the same conversation, but we'll be talking to the organizations that will be in catch-up mode, that will be in panic mode, especially because we're seeing huge growth in Gen AI usage. Clearly, it's transforming how we work. It's transforming how fraudsters operate. And now we're seeing a lot more platforms that allow to orchestrate different Gen AI capabilities to try to make more convincing scams. So we're talking, applications that allow you to generate a voice, generate a face, generate an interaction that seems legitimate, and start prompting, that text-to-speech capability. So you can have a fake avatar speaking with a fake voice, talking to someone, listening to the conversation in real time, transcribing it, finding the proper response, making sure they can socially engineer agents at scale. That's coming. It's there. It's being used. It's being experimented with. Fraud as a service has really emerged since 2020, where anyone can find a fraudster service on a Telegram channel for a few bucks. So I think next year what we're going to see is those tools will be refined to a point that will make biometrics not a matter of if, but when and how quickly can we deploy it. Because fraudsters will have all the tools, and all the fraudsters and all the general people that are not professional fraudsters will have the tools to attack the organizations that did not take these threats seriously. So I think next year we'll have the same conversation, but we'll be talking to people that will be in panic mode, that will have to make a move rapidly. And the problem with this, we talked about proper ways to compare vendors. We talked about proper ways to select a good vendor that encrypts properly, that shares their data on accuracy, on performance. When you're panicking, you don't have time to do that. So they will make mistakes in their choice of vendors. They will have to redeploy something else 6 months later. So, for those of you that don't think it's a huge concern, start thinking about it, start socializing the idea, internally. Make sure your C-suite understands why it's important, and start early. So you have the time to really do a proper RFP, do a proper comparison, and really select a vendor that's going to be a partner for many years, and not someone that's just going to be patching the issue you have today because 6 weeks later, fraudsters will find another way to attack your organization.
Fantastic. Now, Blair, obviously, I'm expecting many more interesting observations to come from you. You've had more time than anybody else to prepare for the question. So
I have, but with that, we're at time, Mark, so I'm not going to go too deep here. But I will say that we have seen, I'm going to echo both what Simon and Sarah have said. Start preparing now, folks. We have seen on the Authentic ID side, we put out a state of identity fraud report twice a year. Our latest half-year report, 1,400% increase in Gen AI attacks. I mean, that's tremendous. Not 14%, 1,400% increase in Gen AI attacks. It is coming very, very quickly. And if don't be in this catch-up mode, because your people cannot detect this stuff. It's going to take technology, well implemented, well thought out technology to prevent this thing from happening to your enterprise, your customers.
That's a great soundbite if I've ever heard it. It's a great place to finish on as well. Maybe the subject of the next webinar is about the Gen AI attack and how we can plummet that. But thank you so much, Simon, Sarah, and Blair, for your time and joining me here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.